What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be talking to you about flow state, constraints and systems, how I'm actively building around each of these three and also solving around that. So like always with these videos, the mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and frameworks, and also just to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, just to come in and be the chief problem solver and ultimately just create as much value as we possibly can, and also build cool things at the same time, and also just to call in visionaries, basically people that understand what our mission is, what it is that we're striving to solve for, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So why I'm obsessed with flow, bottlenecks and systems, I think this is a very fun video to talk about, especially what I am talking about in terms of flow states, bottlenecks. I think those two are so important in every single operations, and just solely just understanding this. So here's the thing. So no team scales unless you stay in flow. So that is basically flow state, where everything is just moving smoothly within the business and the organization internally, to saying, hey, we're actively just getting things done, momentum's building, and we're actively just solving things, and nothing is stalling, and there are no bottlenecks in our process. And even if there are bottlenecks, we have systems and processes in place that we ultimately can use to combat that, and saying, hey, we need to make sure that what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis keeps the momentum up and keeps us in flow state, making sure that we're crushing tasks, we're crushing the things that we need to build, and we're ultimately just moving the needle each and every single day. Ultimately just saying, hey, if there does come a bottleneck, for say for example a bottleneck comes, which is ultimately a point that slows down, which ultimately comes us saying, hey, we need to actively just build for this bottleneck, and we need to make sure that the speed that we solve this bottleneck is the speed that everything's going to be moving at. And we actively need to just take that approach of saying, hey, bottlenecks are ultimately going to be the lifeblood of what makes us progress or regress, and ultimately just understanding that and saying, hey, no product wins unless you kill constraints. So all the constraints, all the things holding your business up internally or externally, asking the questions of what are the factors or the things that are holding this project. Is it communication? Is it tasks not being clear? Just having that, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure we list down all the constraints and we have them down, and ultimately have them systemized as well. Because if we don't have processes in how we're actively building for constraints to combat constraints, we ultimately don't have a process, and we're always scratching our heads in understanding, hey, this is what we're doing in terms of constraints, because when a constraint comes, we don't know what to do. And ultimately saying, hey, no business loss unless you systemize, basically saying that each and every business ultimately needs systems and processes, otherwise it can last or it can scale as well. Just basically coming in and making sure that each and every single moving part, we systemize it and create a process through SOPs, and also just making sure that we build systems around it that ultimately automate our process and ultimately allow us to scale into the future. So this time I've actually broken it down into 3 steps. I kept it light, super light this time, and I just want to, just make sure it's nice and easy and try something different. So number 1 being flow state equals wins. So ultimately saying why this matters is chaos creeps in when teams distracted. Ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that the team is super focused, laser focused on what it is that we need to get done today. Basically asking, hey, what are the 2-3 main things that we need to get done today that ultimately need us to move the needle forward and create leverage for us? And asking these questions on a day-to-day basis to say, hey, what are the things that we have to get done today that ultimately move the needle forward, ultimately just creates a win for us, and also builds momentum. Because once you have momentum with the team, within the team, that momentum compounds, and when that momentum compounds, you just ultimately get into this flow state where you just actively just solving problems and getting things done. And what you don't want to do is ultimately create scenarios where you get distracted within your team. Say, hey, everyone is going out having fun and all these things. Yes, that's cool, but if you're having too much of something, ultimately that leads to distractions, and that momentum then dies. And the number one thing you don't want within the team, at least from what I've realized, is you don't want the momentum to die, because once that momentum dies, it takes a long process for that momentum to come back, and reviving that momentum is a very tedious process, and it takes time, because you ultimately have to stack small wins that ultimately build up that large compound movement to ultimately say, hey, we need to make sure that we're compounding by taking small actionable steps each and every single day that ultimately build that momentum back. And you don't want to break that momentum, because once that momentum breaks, like I said, people don't know what they're doing, they don't know how to get things done. But ultimately systemizing that and building that momentum from an initial get-go ultimately just moves the needle forward and allows you to create leverage, at least from what I've learned. And saying, hey, flow is the zone where devs ship, designers cook, and outreach books deals on autopilot. Basically saying, if we super dial this down in terms of just making sure that everyone's in flow state, they actually just get things done. Saying, hey, developers ship the builds that we need to build, and we have our designers cooking, so they just say, hey, we're done with the design 3-4 days after, and then ultimately then we hand it off to the devs and then say, hey, the devs need to just build stuff, and they just get it done in a short time frame, which is the best scenario. But that only happens, at least from my experience, if that momentum is there and we enter that flow state within the team. And everyone needs to be in that flow state for you to be super locked in and just getting things done, because once you're out of that flow state, it's super hard, at least from my experience, to get back into that flow state. And I think just ultimately just taking those small compounding steps that ultimately build that momentum within the team, saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're constantly stacking wins as well internally, even if it's a small win, to say, hey, we booked a call. That is good. Now ultimately builds that compound, and ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're cooking and we're absolutely just crushing what we're doing each and every single day, and just attacking. And how I'm actively doing this is daily stand-ups to align focus, ultimately also just playing into the compound effect that I was talking about, to say, hey, each and every single day that we're having stand-ups ultimately leads to that big picture vision of us staying aligned and ultimately crushing goals, because each and every single person understands what it is that we need to be doing on a day-to-day basis in order to win. And that aligns focus, which ultimately gets into that flow state. So it's a variety of different factors, at least, to get into that flow state. It's not just one singular thing, it's a buildup of small actionable steps, at least from my experience, to say, hey, flow state, we enter flow state when 1, 2, 3, 4, all these things align, and ultimately through alignment and also compounding from 2-3 weeks back, we ultimately are able to just cook. And saying, hey, single clear objectives per sprint, to making sure that, hey, in as much as it's important to get these compound effects into play, we ultimately need to make sure that there's clarity by having one singular objective, to say, hey, within the sprint, we need to make XYZ KPI, or we need to hit XYZ ROI for our business and our clients as well, making sure that we're just staying on track with as much clarity as possible, and then basically just creating feedback through that. And saying, hey, I call it a one target, no chaos. So if we just have one singular target that we actively are aiming for, I like to also just incorporate 2-3, just depending per project what it is that we're actively working on. But mainly I just like to keep one core objective that everything is built around and is the foundation of what we're striving for within that sprint, and ultimately just ultimately just building around that as well. And saying, hey, what is the first principles question I can ask around this, which is, what's one action today that gets your team into deep flow? And I think deep flow is super important, especially for the team, because you're just so aligned and you're just so motivated and inspired to keep building, and everyone's just super laser locked in and ultimately just building, because those wins that we do get from deep flow state are unmatched, where everyone else is just not sure, relative to when everyone else is just not sure of what is going on XYZ. Ultimately just building that deep flow within the team and also within myself ultimately just allows us to cook within the teams, from the developers, from the SDRs, and also just from the designers as well, and also top level management as well, just a fun fact. And then saying, hey, number 2, which is constraints reveal the truth. I think this is a very important topic to talk about, to say, hey, every system is only as fast as its slowest point, to say, hey, if we have constraints, we need to make sure that we understand that our system is as fast as our slowest point. Whatever bottleneck we have within our system, we need to understand that that is the slowest point and we're moving as fast as that. So by actively understanding that, we're able to say, hey, no matter what constraints we have, we need to actively be on attack mode to actively just solve that constraint as soon as possible by firstly identifying it and then building measures around it and then just repeating those measures to say, hey, we've identified it, we've come up with three possible solutions, this is what we're doing, okay, cool, now we've sorted it out, now let's do it again for the next constraint. Because constraints, you need to hunt them down daily to make sure that, hey, everything is flowing, everything is moving, and I see each and every single moving part within these three, flow state, constraints, and systems. I see them as one thing to say each of them funnel or flow into each other, saying, hey, our slowest point ultimately is as fast as we move, and that constraint needs to be solved today, not tomorrow, not next week, today. Because ultimately, if that constraint is solved slowly, we're moving slowly, and our competition is ultimately iterating faster, or at least I like to believe that our competition understands their constraints and are actively solving on it, are actively solving it, not on a 2 day basis, not on a daily basis, maybe not even on an hourly basis, but on a minute basis. And that's something that I want to scale up into the future to get super nano on. By nano, I mean just making sure that we're super dialed in and making sure that we're solving this on a minute to minute basis rather than an hourly basis. And I know we still have a bit to go around that, but I'm still figuring out how to basically just shorten the time span that we can say, hey, we have a constraint, XYZ minutes are dropping from this, let's solve it now. And just actively being able to communicate that to the team as well and saying, hey, how I'm actively doing this is dev slow. I sharpen my brief to make sure that, hey, my brief is as sharp as possible, and they ultimately just understand what it is that they need to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and saying, hey, outreach is lagging, I rework the copy, saying, hey, I need to make sure that I'm actively tweaking the copy, making sure that, hey, we're actively solving those constraints and we're pumping out, because those constraints are our slowest point and we are moving as slow as our slowest point. So basically just saying, hey, we need to move quicker and we need to build faster and iterate faster, but understanding where our constraints are, basically our bottlenecks, we are then able to then say, hey, let's solve this now, because it ultimately leads to what it is that we're building. And if we're as slow as our constraints, we're actively not just getting things done and we're not entering that deep flow state. And I think entering deep flow state is the first stage before you then are able to understand that the constraints also play a factor in entering that deep flow state. But in order to get to that deep flow state, you ultimately need to understand the constraints, because constraints come as well. And ultimately just saying, hey, the team's logged, I asked what is the bottleneck, just ultimately just understanding what the bottlenecks are and solving for them on a per hour basis, not on a daily basis, not on a minute basis just yet, but ultimately saying, hey, our competition is shipping each and every single minute, let's make sure that we're dialing it in as quickly as possible and not actively just building around that. And then asking the first principles question of saying, hey, what's one choke point that's slowing your system right now, and how fast can you kill it, to ultimately say, hey, are our automations not working, what is not working within our system, and actively just killing it fast, basically solving it as soon as possible, because that creates as much value as possible, then ultimately allows us to just keep pushing the needle forward. Because you as a business owner, and I'm sure so many people agree with me on this, if you're moving slowly, your competition is ultimately moving twice as fast, because you're moving slowly due to constraints that you're not taking proactive approach. And I'm super bullish on this to say, hey, each and every single day I need to make sure I understand the constraints both internally and externally, to make sure that I'm actively building on that, so that we can then scale up our operations into the future by ultimately just systemizing it as well. And I think this is super important in every stage of business, and even just in your life. I think this is super important to just be able to understand what are the constraints in your life on a day-to-day basis, saying, hey, are you not reading each and every single day, is that why you're not getting ideas? And ultimately just understanding, saying, hey, in another example, are you not getting new ideas on a day-to-day basis on how you can grow or improve the business operations? Then hey, what is the constraint? You're actively reading 1 page per day when you could be reading 10, and off of those 10 pages per day, you can get one sentence that ultimately unlocks a nugget that ultimately unlocks you a new level of business and also opportunities as well. And saying, hey, third point, which is systems keep you dangerous, and I think this ties in well with the other 2 points. One, why this matters is systems are the rails for scale, so basically without them chaos creeps back in, and I think this one's kind of self-explanatory, but basically saying, hey, you cannot scale without systems, and chaos is going to creep in if you don't have these systems. By saying, hey, each and every day, are you manually logging in your data? And if so, that is ultimately not allowing you to scale, and that failure to scale is leading your competition to be 10 steps ahead of you. And do you really want your competition to be 10 steps ahead of you? At least that's how I like to think about it, and making sure that I'm actively moving the needle on a day-to-day basis and just pumping things forward and saying, hey, how I'm actively doing this is dev on GitHub, making sure that the developers on my team actively understand what is going on GitHub, that they're actively in sync and in flow state as well, and saying, hey, designs in Figma, making sure that we have systems in terms of how we do our design output, and making sure that each and every person on our team understands that, and outreach for lemless, making sure that, hey, we ultimately have systems and measures, sequences that we run, sequence flows for different niches or different flows that we are actively running, basically saying, hey, we're running different lemless sequences for different messagings and also different positionings to A/B test, for example, and saying, hey, CRM in Airtable, so we're basically building a leads tracker on Airtable because that's where we centralize our data to make sure that, hey, we're building a modular solution in terms of how it is that we're actively running our operations, and saying, hey, everything has a container, everything has a process. So say basically we need to make sure that every single thing that has a container has a process, and that process is super dialed in. And ultimately I think this is a framework that Dan Martel says a lot, which is basically the camcorder method. Shout out to Dan Martel for this, which is basically you basically record yourself doing it, and then you ask your team, hey, do you understand what is going on? And then they basically build off of the SOPs based off what they see and the way that they interpret it, which ultimately allows your team to basically see, for you to also see, hey, this is where the knowledge gap is, and this is how I can actively build and help them bridge that gap. And ultimately saying, hey, what's the one process you can lock in this week that frees you forever? Basically just building systems and processes for each and every single thing. I think for me, I am super dialed in terms of building processes and systems for each and every single moving part. Like I even have a system process that I'm actively building for naming things. So basically having a systems process for naming things, saying, hey, I want to name this Killer Chaos OS. Okay, how do I think about that? What's the mental model that I'm actively just going to implement in terms of coming up with names? It needs to mean something. It needs to have XYZ criteria. And into the future, how would this name be interpreted? Is it a name that is going to last 10, 20, 30 years? And is it a brand worth building? And I am super, super dialed in when it comes to building on frameworks and mental models like ODCAM and Killer Chaos OS, and also just the chaos cycle feedback loop that I have as well, and actively just building that. And I think it's super exciting and fun to just systemize everything, because that ultimately frees you up. And ultimately, as you're scaling, I think for us, just having those processes are going to be the foundation of how it is that we're building into the future, and the playbooks that we're ultimately going to be passing down as we scale into the future. And this has been a fun video. I really enjoyed just rambling and just talking about different systems, flow states, constraints, and systems. I think all these three aspects come in together, and one does not work without the other. I think that's also another very important point, to just ultimately get those constraints down and super locked in, so that you can just enter that flow state, and ultimately from that flow state you build your systems around that, to making sure that each and every single part lives with each other and not just one independent part that cannot function with the other ones. So I think each and every single part is super important to keep in mind and also just build upon. Like I said, we'll make a lot of mistakes, we'll get a lot of things wrong, but I know that into the future, these plays that we're making right now are ultimately just gonna help shape our mental models and frameworks, and ultimately just allow us to document and also build cool things in the same time. And then if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, make sure to subscribe on LinkedIn, and also make sure to, LinkedIn, YouTube, subscribe on YouTube. If you guys want to hit me up, make sure to drop a comment or just Instagram, X, and I will see you guys in the next video.